Once again, we turn another page in the story of Auntie Alice. The following excerpt is lifted from the book Legendary Territorians by no lesser NT legend himself in the late Reg Harris. Now comes the story of a steel run, a bush bet, and a Dunny disaster. From the early days of station life in the centre of Australia come two more true Territory yarns. Stories of young ambition, bush ingenuity, and the kind of decisions that seemed like a good idea at the time. Lie Underdown had bought reinforcing steel from an army disposal auction in Darwin and needed it freighted here to Alice Springs. He approached Kurt Johansson, who just started a transport business in the day, for a quote to haul 180 tonnes of said steel south. Kurt quoted £20 a tonne. Lie talked him down to £14, but there was one little problem. The steel actually weighed closer to 220 tonnes. By the time Kurt was down to the last load, Lie still had not paid not even 1 penny. So Kurt hid the remaining steel and told Lie he wouldn't be getting it until the account was settled. Not happy Lie, who owned a semi-trailer himself, sent Mick Costello to Darwin to collect what was left. Mick set off on a 3,000-kilometre round trip in a truck with no windscreen, no rear window, and no side windows. He found the steel, loaded it up, but some of the length stuck so far out the back they almost scraped the road. The Stuart Highway was little more than a single strip of bitumen, and traffic in those days was scarce. Mick drove right down the middle of the road with the wind roaring through the cab. He could not hear a thing. Soon enough on the travels, one Wally Mason and Vic DeFontway caught up behind him in Tuart's passenger coach. They blasted their horn again and again, but Mick never heard it. Vic DeFontway, meanwhile, was looking at the steel hanging off the back of the truck and came up with a, albeit dangerous, but ingenious plan. "If you can get me close enough, I'll jump onto the steel," he told Wally. "But the moment I jump, you better hit the brakes. If I miss, you'll run me over." And everything went to plan. Vic edged along the steel, reached through the rear window and tapped Mick on the shoulder and politely asked, "Would you mind pulling over? We'd like to pass." Well, you can only imagine the look on Mick's face. The next story centres on one Peter Gunner and a mate of his who arrived in Tennant Creek as teenagers chasing the dream of working in the outback cattle industry. They soon found jobs on a nearby cattle station, but a few weeks of hard bush life quickly changed what they thought outback life would be like. The camp cook was one of those old-style, rough-and-tumble bush characters. Didn't quite believe in hygiene or washing. When it came time to cook, he'd be covered in grease and grime. And the boys noticed something interesting. The more dampers he needed, the cleaner his hands became. Each night he'd bake one damper for each man in camp, and the boys worked out that the last two were obviously going to be the cleanest. They didn't want to ask outright for the risk of upsetting him, so they turned it into a game, betting him 3p that they could pick the last two dampers. They were usually wrong, but they ate well enough, and at least it was clean food. When the station owner and his wife headed off to Adelaide for 3 weeks, they were left a list of instructions for the boys to do, including digging a new toilet pit. But with the boss and his wife away, Peter and his mate spent most of their time buggering around and playing with the boss's .22 rifle. By the time the return date loomed, that job of digging a new toilet pit had not yet been done. When they finally started digging, they hit rock-hard ground. So they came up with a solution. Pouring 20 gallons of diesel into the existing Dunny pit and setting that alight. Well, you can imagine, it burned for 2 days and dropped the level to around 2 feet. When the boss returned, his first question was simple. Why hadn't the toilet been moved? They explained their burnout method but said they only used 1 gallon of diesel. They were praised for their initiative. That night, the boss's wife, shall we say, a larger woman, went to use the toilet. The outhouse structure was just a small building over a pit with a narrow rail you had to balance on. Unbeknown to anyone, the fire had weakened the underside of that rail. Upon sitting down, her ample weight broke it, and she fell backwards into 2 feet of sludge. Her screams brought everyone running. They tied a rope to her, but her hands were too slippery and covered with gunk and poo to get a grip, so they fetched a long pole and levered her out. Peter and his mate didn't stick around. They headed bush for a week and waited for things to cool down, or at least for the boss to see the funny side of life. From a steel run across the Stuart Highway, to a camp cook's curious habits and a betting game over damper, to the outback shortcut that turned into a very memorable mistake. These are the kinds of stories that could only come from remote station life in central outback Australia.
Join us next time for more stories and legendary Territorians by Reg Harris.